Hello, I'm Owen Thurtle, and I'd like to take you on a virtual tour of Ipswich. I'm an Ipswich town guide, and most summers I spend some of the time taking people on tours of Ipswich, showing them interesting buildings and that sort of thing, and telling them stories about the buildings. Well, we can't do that this year because of COVID, but I thought I'd make a record of one of my favourite walks, a virtual walk, a walk entitled Victims and Martyrs of Ipswich. It tells us something about some of the interesting people associated with the buildings of Ipswich. So let's see if I can share the screen and get the PowerPoint going. Right, and here's the first slide. I hope you recognize it. It's one of the well-known churches in the centre of Ipswich, called St Clement's Church. It was in the poorest part of Ipswich at one point, and it opened up a daughter church called Holy Trinity in the cross away from it, in a place called the Potteries, which was the very poorest part of Ipswich. But the reason I have it in our talk is because it's dedicated to St Clement. And who was St Clement? Well, he was the first bishop of Rome, or the second if you count Peter. But the interesting thing about him is that in his older age, he was sent to the quarries, was persecuted, and in fact, that was not enough. They decided to kill him. And the way they killed him was by tying him to an anchor and throwing him overboard. So his symbol has always been the anchor, which you'll see halfway up the tower of St Clement's Church. Moving on, and as we go, make sure you don't cross the road unless I tell you it's time to go. We get to St Mary the Tower, or St Mary the Tower, even though it's got a steeple. And there are some interesting things associated with this church as well. For instance, what are those things sticking out the side of the tower? There are sculptures there, and since it's a tower, there are 4 of them, which might give you a clue as to what they are. There's one of them close up, that's a man. And there's another, an ox. And the other 2 are a lion and an eagle. And these are the traditional symbols of the 4 gospel writers. Luke is ox, Mark, lion, Matthew, the man, John, the eagle. And tradition tells us that both Matthew and Mark were martyred under the Romans. And in the garden associated with St Mary is a very interesting memorial to this man called John Patterson. It's not that obvious, you have to know where it is. It's the other side of the garden to the south entrance. And he was an interesting character, the first bishop to Melanesia. He was appointed by the first bishop of New Zealand in about the middle of the 19th century and spent 10, 20 years traveling the islands of Melanesia trying to teach them about Christianity and bringing them education. In his time, he learned about 20 different languages and was reasonably influential among the islanders. But eventually, he ran out of luck. He had an interesting approach to the islanders. They were easily frightened, and so when he sailed up to an island, he would fill a top hat with his possessions and some gifts for them, and swim ashore, pushing the top hat ahead of him. Well, why was he doing that? It's because the islanders were under threat. They'd met white people before, but most of them were cruel. The whalers used to go ashore to these islands and steal stuff from them, take food whenever they wanted it. And even worse than that, they'd sometimes take their young men as slaves. So the islanders were very suspicious of visitors. And Bishop Patterson tried to reassure them by approaching them in that way. On this occasion, actually, he went ashore in a boat, a rowing boat, with a couple of companions. And they were suspicious and, in fact, killed him, clubbed him to death. And he is quite a well-known martyr from the 19th century. There was no punishment for these people. It was understood that they were just frightened. But there's a cathedral on one of the islands named after Bishop Patterson. That was on the 20th of September, 1871. And it's still a day that we are allowed to remember in the Church of England. And you might say, what's he doing being being memorialized in an Ipswich church? Well, he married into the Cobbold family. So that's why he's there. Now we move on to some better known martyrs. And this is an old picture of the Cornhill. And in the place where there's a statue on the extreme left, to the left of the old town hall, that's where there was a martyrdom of two of the Reformation martyrs, Alice Driver, Alexander Gooch. They were burned to death at about that point there in 1558. Alice was quite a character, a 30-year-old peasant woman, but she had been taught to read, had got hold of an English Bible and knew what she believed, was quite prepared to argue with the authorities about her faith and to stick to what she believed, along with Alexander. When the time came for the execution, there were so many of their friends and supporters there wanting to shake their hands before it happened that the sheriff nearly had to abandon procedures, but it went ahead. Sadly, 2 weeks later, Queen Mary died, and they would have been released if they'd survived that long. This is a memorial that you probably recognise from Christchurch Park Hospital to all 7, or is it 9, of the Ipswich martyrs from the time of the Reformation. Now we move on to another man, an Ipswich person, Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey. Not exactly a martyr, but certainly a victim of Henry. But he was born and bred in Ipswich, left for greater things, became Henry's prime operator, and tried to do some good for the people of Ipswich by establishing a school in his memory in Ipswich. He did actually persecute people to some extent, but very seldom did he execute anyone. But one of his victims, one of the people he pressurized, was called Thomas Bilney, who was one of the early reformers. And although he was not against the theology of the transubstantiation, he was opposed to the worship of saints and the veneration of idols. And he preached strongly against that, which Wolsey disapproved of. So Wolsey stopped him from doing that, and Bilney went away for a couple of years to think about it all, but eventually decided he was right, that he had to preach against images. He was a priest and regularly preached. And when he was in a chapel called St. George's on St. George's Street, Ipswich, not this church, But nearby, he was arrested and ended up being executed in Norwich. This is an old 19th century church called Salem Church, Salem Chapel. And as you can see, it's now used as Wolsey's studio. Well, this is all that's left of Wolsey's great educational institution for Ipswich. But in its time, there was a building behind the Watergate, and they took over the nearby St. Peter's Church. And it was all arranged by Wolsey's right-hand man, a man called Thomas Cromwell. Not a martyr, but certainly a victim as well of Henry VIII. And Thomas Cromwell was a very interesting character. He was one who was convinced of the truths of the Reformation and did his best to promote them in England. It was he who had the Bible translated into English, published, and a copy put into every church. All this under the nose of King Henry VIII. And it was Cromwell who in 1528 came to Ipswich for the grand opening of Wolsey's College. And he had arranged it all, and it took place in that church there, St. Peter's. But within a couple of years, as I said, Wolsey had fallen from favour. And 15 years later, Cromwell, who had taken over his place, also fell from favour and was executed. Now we move on to another church, the Unitarian Church, as we call it. And this is the product of persecution, actually. When it was built, it was the first Presbyterian church in Ipswich, because it was difficult to be anything other than an Anglican in Britain in the 17th century. And when Charles II got back into power in 1662, he brought in an act of uniformity, which meant that everybody had to be Anglicans. And this put those who had Presbyterian beliefs in an awkward situation, to say nothing of those who had Baptist beliefs. But later on, when Charles's brother James lost the throne and William and Mary came in, a clearly Protestant couple, there was a degree of tolerance, and they brought in, the Act of Toleration, 1689. You could be Protestants. You didn't have to go to an Anglican church. And so in 1700, this group of Presbyterians built themselves this church in Ipswich. It's wooden made from top to bottom, and is carefully preserved at the moment. They felt a bit nervous about their situation, even though there'd been an act of toleration. And you probably know that in those doors, there's a peephole that they could look out of to see who was trying to get into their church. Over the years, these Presbyterians drifted theologically, and you might say the congregation became victims of vague vicars, vague ministers, because they gradually lost their faith in Jesus as the Son of God, and ended up as Unitarians, having no longer believed in the Trinity or in the deity of Jesus. Now we move on to another church with some other stories associated with it. This is St. Mary Quay, down on the docks. Beautifully restored church. It was dissolving in the waters of central Ipswich until recently, when Mind took it over and got a grant to restore it, and they've done a beautiful job. And one of the things that you can see inside is this memorial brass to Thomas Pounder. who was a merchant, a successful merchant in Ipswich. That's his merchant mark in the middle of the brass. And he died in 1526 and was buried under the altar in St. Mary's Church, which he thought would do his soul some good. And in his memorial brass, there's a slot left for the time, the date and the time of his wife's death, which was expected in due course later on. But in fact, she outlived him by many years. She was herself Emma Pounder, a successful merchant in Ipswich. And whilst she was living in Ipswich, the teaching of the Reformation came into the town, and she became a believer in the teachings of the Reformation. Fox's Book of Martyrs records that she was under some persecution, but did not suffer the death penalty. She had to go into hiding. And in fact, she moved away from St. Mary's Church and was an adherent of St. Clement's Church, which was more open to Reformation teachings at the time. So when she came to die, she wasn't bothered about being buried under the altar, and her name was never added to the brass. And this nearly brings us to the end of our virtual walk around Ipswich. But I thought I'd end with a memorial or a church, no, a building reminding us of some other virtual victims. This is near to our churches, actually. It's on Britannia Road. It's a Victorian building, block of flats now, but it was built as part of the workhouse that was situated between Bloomfield Street and Britannia Road. And in there, those who were unlucky enough to lose all their money or lose their parents and had no one else to look after them, they were put there in a workhouse. It was a workhouse for children. And for the earlier part of the 20th century, about 100, 120 kids every Sunday were marched down the road to St. John's Church for Sunday school. Let's hope they had some kind treatment there. So that ends our virtual tour of Ipswich. I hope you found it interesting to hear about some of the challenging people. Others were not so brave, but we're all human, and it makes us wonder what we might leave behind when our course is finished. Thanks.